So now we're going to go back to where we were before and continue the story. And remember, we are talking about the time in Medina. Now, a few other things happen in Medina that are very interesting to think about. First of all, in Medina, there are a number of Arabic tribes. But in Medina, there were also 3 Jewish tribes in the city. And for the most part, they lived fairly peacefully with the Arabs in the city. And when Muhammad first comes to Medina with his followers, the Jews seem to accept him kind of wholeheartedly. I mean, here's a monotheist standing up against polytheism, which of course they've been surrounded with. And so the Jews kind of think, great, an Arab that gets it. But along the way, 2 of the 3 tribes actually turn against Muhammad. And one of the tribes, the matriarch of the tribe, she brings Muhammad dinner under false pretenses and poisons him, tries to kill him. Muhammad survives. However, many scholars have noted that his health probably was compromised from that point on. I don't know if you ever had someone you've known who's been poisoned and has overcome it. Still, their renal functions might be compromised, for the rest of their life. And some people think that Muhammad might have lived longer had he not gone through this ordeal. But at any rate, he does survive it. But this really is another disillusioning idea here. Muhammad apparently thought that the other 2 monotheistic religions he was most in contact with, Judaism and Christianity, were certainly going to welcome this monotheistic movement among Arabs and consider, his Muslims as kind of a sister faith. And again, this would be the thing that a good man wanting peace would hope for. But he's disillusioned, and he realizes that, they're not going to be supported by Judaism. They're not going to be supported by Christianity. This is a movement of God that's going to have to stand on its own. And at that point in time, they actually change one of their main practices. We're going to get to when we talk about the 5 pillars in the next video. But when they used to pray 5 times a day, they would pray towards Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem is a holy place. Islam believes in all of the Hebrew prophets all the way to Jesus, which we'll talk about in just a second. And so Jerusalem is a holy place. And you'll find out that, shortly, they're going to actually build 2 very, very important sacred buildings on Mount Moriah, on the Temple Mount, which we already talked about, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We did talk about this in a previous lecture, so I won't go on here. But anyway, they had been praying 5 times a day towards Jerusalem, which they kind of saw as the center of their faith. But with this, Muhammad realizes, no, this is a new movement of God. You're going to have to stand on your own, not going to be an arm of Judaism or anything else. And so at that point, they change and they start praying 5 times a day towards Mecca, because that is where Gabriel revealed the message from God. This is where the movement started. This is where God commanded Muhammad to recite the things that he is being told. And so this is how they changed. And of course, to this day, they still pray 5 times a day towards Mecca. And so wherever you're at, you might be praying in a different direction. If you're in Russia, you're facing south. If you're in Tampa, Florida with us, you're facing pretty much east. So again, here's something else that was a bit disillusioning. Now, why do you think the Jews turned against Muhammad? Well, one of the reasons is very simple. And that is, he's beginning to be thought of as a great prophet by his followers. And in Islam, Muhammad is considered the seal of the prophets. Remember when we talked about scrolls, which is the way most things are written in this day, when you're done writing or reading a scroll, you seal it, you close it up. And so when you call him the seal of the prophets, what his followers are saying is that he is the last in a line of many highly esteemed prophets. I mean, going all the way back to Abraham, all the way through the Hebrew prophets, all the way up to Jesus, they still believe in these prophets. But they believe that he is the last in the line of these important prophets. So this is the end of God's revelation to mankind, and now we look forward to the time when God will actually set up his kingdom on earth. kind of the same thing Christians think about Jesus, being the last in the line of prophets, and now we wait for Jesus to set up his kingdom on earth. It's very similar to Muslims. The difference, of course, being that they very much accept Jesus as a great prophet, whereas Jews don't. I mean, there are Jews that believe in Jesus. They're often called completed Jews and or Messianic Jews, but the vast majority of Jews obviously don't. Muslims, by and large, consider Jesus a great prophet. A lot of people wrongly think that Muslims reject Jesus, reject his ministry, reject his teachings, whatever, and that is just not true. In fact, one of the reasons that Muhammad may have been turned against by the Jews is he starts to look a little bit too much like a Messiah. He starts to look a little bit too much like the way Christians think about Jesus as like the conclusion of the whole line of prophets and everything else. And by the way, the Jews have a good reason for not liking Christians. By this point in time, Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire, has a great deal of power, and they already have a great history of persecuting Jews in many different ways. If nothing else, the fact they don't have the same civil rights as other people, can't own businesses, but they've created, the Christians have created theologies about how all the Jews are damned and have used it to justify all kinds of unethical action against them, even in the 600s, even in the 7th century already. And it gets worse, as you probably know. And we've had to leave that history in Judaism and in Christianity behind because, of course, this condensed schedule this semester has meant we've had to leave some of the curriculum behind. But all of that to say that Jews are not against anything that Jesus did or taught as much as they are against the way the people that believe in Jesus have treated them. So Muhammad now, his followers are talking about him like he is like the promised Messiah to come to set up God's kingdom, and the Jews are not down with that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is kind of related to it, and may be that Muhammad just had too high a view of Jesus himself. So let's talk about this here. What do Muslims think about Jesus? Well, first of all, they believe he's a great prophet. They believe he was born of a virgin. They literally believe that God did a miracle and impregnated Mary when she was a virgin. They believe in that. That he didn't have a human father. They believe that he was born, was a great prophet. They believe in all of his miracles that he did, all of them. And they think that his teachings are good, though they think that maybe some of them might have been transmitted incorrectly or maybe are interpreted incorrectly by some Christians. But that's the same thing I think about Judaism, that a lot of the teachings of the prophets were interpreted incorrectly. The only thing they really have a problem with in terms of Jesus, two things. The first one is shirk. Remember what shirk means? Shirk means idolatry. Shirk means making anything God that's not God. And so by this time, it was in the early 4th century that Christians decided that Jesus was divine just like God the Father. And even in Islam today, I mean, there's no confusion between the creator and the creature. The creation is not God. God creates, and the creature is the thing that was created. And nothing that has flesh is God. Now, that just makes a lot of sense. And a lot of people on earth would feel the same way about that logical reasoning. But if you've grown up in a church and you've been taught your entire life that Jesus was somehow God in the flesh, it just seems right to you because you're so familiar with that teaching and you've accepted it so long. But it's kind of hard to explain that to someone who doesn't. Let me go on to the second thing here, and this will make a whole lot more sense. The first thing, of course, is shirk, which is applying deity, the same kind of deity of the unknown God that's beyond the universe, beyond your comprehension, and applying that to someone who came in a material form. That's shirk. That's idolatry to them. And the second thing is this. It is the idea that somehow Jesus' death enabled God to finally forgive you. Do some bracketing, Christians. You're going to have to do this. Pretend you're someone else. Pretend you haven't heard what you heard your entire life growing up in church, that somehow the shed blood of Jesus made it easier for God to forgive you. And you have to think critically. By the way, people have thought critically about this for many generations. And Christians are not in agreement as to how the crucifixion and the shed blood of Jesus forgives sins. They really aren't. There's all kinds of different ideas, and there's big problems with all of them. The idea, for one, that God is so righteous that he must have payment for every sin, and he doesn't want to take payment from you, so instead he's going to torture and kill his own son and take payment from him. Problem, okay? Why does he have to do this? If he's God, there's no ethical standard above him. Every ethical standard that we know about is under him. We've somehow projected it, we've somehow embraced it, but who is telling God what he must do? Why is it, if God wants to forgive, he has to have blood first? And so this is important to think about. One of the other ways is that somehow God had to pay a ransom to get us back from sin. A ransom. And Paul uses that metaphor too, so that's another one we come up with. But the analogy falls apart. When you pay a ransom, it means that someone has taken something or someone that you care for, and you're paying the ransom to get them back. It's kind of like redeeming something out of a pawn shop or something that you've pawned, or getting back someone that's been kidnapped. So who is it that's so powerful that God has to pay a ransom to the person to get you back? Or, it's usually thought of, kind of like the Chronicles of Narnia, if you've ever read that book or seen that movie. There's the idea that this stone table, where Aslan, the lion, who actually willingly gives himself for a sacrifice, he's a type of Christ in the movie, and giving himself as a sacrifice, the stone table is actually broken in half. He breaks the power of this magic that exists in all the world. And the magic, one of the things that it says is that the brother Edmund, who has betrayed them to the evil queen, somehow now his soul belongs to the evil queen, and they're not going to get his soul back from the evil queen without some kind of a holy price. Well, this is exactly the kind of theology you have in Christianity, which of course is what C.S. Lewis was going for when he created this allegorical story here. But the problem is, when it's explained, Aslan is saying, yeah, the queen, she knew the magic, but she didn't know the deeper magic. That if someone who did not deserve to die gave their life, the power of the stone table would be broken. And again, this all sounds really, really great, but you got to ask yourself, who put these laws in place? If God has to come in some kind of physical form, whether it's Jesus or a lion, and has to give himself a sacrifice for sin, who made the law that he had to do that? It implies that there's some power greater than God, even if it's the natural forces in the universe that somehow God has to comply with. Which brings us back to the idea that all the monotheistic religions share, and that is that, God is the all-merciful. He forgives just because he wants to, just because he desires to, just because you're sorry, he forgives you. So, why does he need to torture and publicly humiliate and kill his son before he can figure out how to forgive you? Keep bracketing. Let's follow to the end of this argument. Okay? Let's say you sin against me. And you come back to me later on and you realize, man, I'm sorry I screwed up. The worst in me came out. And I didn't understand. I'm really sorry. Will you please forgive me? Guess what? I can do that. And I will do that. And I'm just a sinful man myself, but I can forgive you just because I want to. But what would it be like if you came to me and I said, oh my gosh, Joe, or Josephine, I'd really like to forgive you, but, I'm just so righteous that my soul requires some kind of sacrifice before, wait, I've got an idea. Stay right there, Jojo. I got an idea. And so I go and I grab my only child, my daughter, only one I got, and I publicly torture her horribly, humiliate her, and then put her to death in front of a huge crowd. And then I come back to you and say, good news! I just tortured and humiliated and killed my own daughter. Now I can forgive you. You're forgiven, Jojo. That's exactly how ridiculous it sounds to someone who has not heard that doctrine their entire life. I'm not telling you it's right. I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm not telling you anything. I'm telling you that you need to imagine what it's like for someone to hear that doctrine that has never heard it. as some kind of inviolable truth all their life programmed into them. It might offend you, but it sounds kind of nutty. And by the way, it doesn't just sound nutty to Muslims. It sounds nutty to Buddhists. It sounds nutty to Hindus. It sounds nutty to anybody that's not really familiar with the doctrine. Why would a merciful, all-powerful God not have the power to just forgive you because he wants to? Why does he have to punish someone else? Who made this law that he has to do this? So my point is, Christianity has never really kind of figured this out. In different forms of Christianity, they have different ways of focusing on the crucifixion and resurrection, and they don't even agree which is the more important. In Roman Catholicism, the crucifixion, the suffering is more important, but in Eastern Orthodox religion, the resurrection from the dead is more important in terms of procuring your salvation. So again, it's one of these things that's very difficult for Christians even to figure out what it means. They usually look at it as some kind of a mystery and just give thanks to God for that they don't understand. But you got to understand, this doesn't make much sense to people who've never heard it before. So these are the two big problems that Islam has with Christianity. Number one, making Jesus equal to the great unknown God. That's shirk. That's idolatry. And second, thinking that God is under some kind of law higher than him, where he actually has to torture and kill his own son before he can figure out how to forgive you. Those are the things they object to. Okay, one other comment here before we go on, and that is that sometimes you'll find people who are faulting Muhammad because he marries Abu Bakr's daughter when she's like 13. And of course, he's much, much older. And you have to realize this is a different world. If there was anything wrong with doing that, he would have received some kind of ethical backlash, which there's none. Now, another thing you may not realize is that we kind of retell Christian stories and Jewish stories according to our idea of what's appropriate today. For instance, you might not know that when Jacob arrived in Padan Aram and he sees Rachel and falls in love and makes a covenant with Laban to marry her for 7 years' work, you may not know that Jacob was in his 70s and Rachel was a teenager. I don't know if that's more or less offensive than the fact that Abraham married his own sister. But again, we don't like to think about those things. We like to retell the story. Here's two young people that fell in love, but 70-ish and 16. No, that's not okay. That's not okay in our way of thinking. Now, you want to go to Jesus and his parents, his presumed parents, his father Joseph and his mother Mary. Have you noticed in the Gospels Joseph is nowhere around? It's probably because he's dead, but his mom's around. In fact, his mom is around for a while after Jesus dies. And so, good chance Joseph is a lot older than Mary. It is entirely likely that Joseph, Jesus' presumed father, could have been in his 40s and Mary could have been 16. We don't like to think about that, but it's a different world. So when you see people anachronistically projecting their values on a society, centuries or millennia beforehand, well, you just have to take it all with a grain of salt. The world isn't the same as it was back then. And the next thing is having all of these wives. Again, it is considered an ethical thing to do to take your brother's wife as your own if your brother dies, to give her children if she doesn't already have them that will be legally assigned to her deceased husband. And you also are supposed to give them part of your inheritance, which again, a lot of guys don't want to do, which is why they shirk their responsibility in this area. So in Judaism, we call this the Levirate law. And there are stories about that law and about people who tried to get out of fulfilling that law, and about people who, even though they really weren't the closest relatives, still stood up and said, I'll do it. And that was, a person of some repute. And this is all in the Jewish tradition. So it's the same thing. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about coming back to Mecca. How in the world does this happen? Well, after that final siege, when the Meccans are demoralized, looks like they've given up. They realize the Medinans are too strong. Muhammad figures, well, during the time of religious pilgrimage to worship, I mean, everybody has a truce, everybody has a peace during that time, so why can't we go and worship our God at the Kaaba in Mecca just like everybody else? And so he actually goes with his disciples to worship at Mecca. And when the Meccans see him drawing near with thousands of Muslims, they freak out. They're not ready for this yet. I mean, they're still thinking of the people that might be vengeful that want to destroy them. And so the leaders of the city actually talk to Muhammad and say, look, the people are terrified. Give us a year to acquaint them with the idea that now we're going to be friends so they don't freak out when you come next year. And we'll make a peace treaty. And so it's another disillusioning incident here. Muhammad goes ahead and makes the peace treaty. And by the way, some of his followers are a little bit upset. It's kind of like, we could take the city right now. Why are you doing this? But they submit because they respect it. But the peace treaty is broken almost immediately. People are sacking each other's caravans again. And I guess Muhammad figures out that a peace treaty isn't worth anything more than the paper or vellum or, papyrus that it is written on. And so what ends up happening is after the treaty is broken, Muhammad comes back to Mecca with 10,000 men. Ironically, this is about the same amount of men that besieged Medina and could not take the city. So Muhammad comes back with 10,000 men. The Meccans see him coming and are freaked out of their minds, and they surrender without a fight. Muhammad considers this a miracle. I mean, this could have been a bloodbath. They could have been decimated, and yet no blood had to be shed. This is a miracle of God. And so, a little bit into the heart of Muhammad here, this is a wonderful miracle that God has wrought, Shall we stain it with blood? No, not at all. If God caused this to happen peacefully, then we'll go ahead with God's plan. So what Muhammad does is he goes into the Kaaba, he destroys all of the 360 idols, and makes a ruling that never again will anybody but Allah, the God of Abraham, be worshipped in this place. And anyone who is willing to submit to that is forgiven. And if you don't like it, you can leave and go somewhere else, because that's the way it's working in this city. But all of these people, he forgives them all. And by the way, that is so uncommon. In history, when you finally get a victory and you finally have captured the leaders of your enemy that have killed so many of your people, your sons, your husbands, your fathers, you don't just forgive them. You humiliate them publicly. You torture them publicly. So this is really unusual. And we don't see too many examples of this. In fact, during the Crusades, we do see a few examples. And you know who they are? They're Muslim commanders following the example of Muhammad when they forgive the leaders of the Crusader forces that they've conquered. While this is very rare, there is an example of this in history that is very compelling. And it's a 20th century example. A few years back, Mandela died. Nelson Mandela. And there was a very big deal made about it, and I was a little bit saddened to know that a large percentage of my sophomore religion students really didn't have any idea why he was famous or why he was respected. I think some of them had seen a movie with Matt Damon, where Mandela's promoting, sports. But other than that, they really had no idea what in the world went on and why he was so famous. And another guy they don't really understand is a guy named Desmond Tutu, who was actually the Archbishop in South Africa. And he is actually still alive, though very old. If you get a chance to see him, by all means, do so. I saw him at USF a number of years ago when I was a graduate student there. Very inspiring. But anyway, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu are the two just superheroes, if you will, from South Africa. And the reason is South Africa had been ruled by an apartheid government. The whites were the ruling power, and the blacks were subjugated. They had a much worse life, were not involved in any kind of government, and so they were campaigning for greater rights, and many of them were disappeared. People would come in the middle of the night and raid your houses and pull black men out of their houses, and they would never be seen again. So Nelson Mandela was one of the revolutionaries, if you want to call him that, and he actually ended up being imprisoned for 26 years, 26 and a half, I believe, years he was imprisoned. But finally, the movement is successful. Finally, he is released from prison, and guess what? Nelson Mandela is elected as the first president of this new government, this new anti-apartheid government. What would you want to do? So many people slaughtered. Wouldn't you want to have some kind of war crimes trials? I mean, we had the Nuremberg trials after World War II, right? Wouldn't you want to do something like that? But he and Desmond Tutu, as much as they'll confess, they felt this anger, they felt this need for vengeance, but they knew that the only way that they had a chance to create this country that they envisioned, that they had worked for, that they had suffered for, the only way they had a chance is to build it on a better foundation than vengeance, because they'd be spending decades trying all of these war criminals, and it would define them. So what they did is they created something called the Truth Commission. And if somebody who was involved in these war crimes came and made a public statement, it kind of looked like a courtroom where they would come up and they would actually testify and the whole thing was filmed. But if they would tell everything that they did and tell where they buried the body so people could get back their loved ones to give them a proper burial, they would be given amnesty and they were not persecuted for their war crimes. Again, this is just so unprecedented. And that's why Mandela and Desmond Tutu were heroes. And so hopefully some of you who don't know much about them, you will research a little bit more. Because again, this is really unprecedented, the action that they took. And they're heroes for very good reason. Two of my heroes, that's for sure. For the next video, we will talk about life after the taking of Mecca, after the death of Muhammad. And I will see you then.